admitting a lot of people. They're rolling in really fast, which is awesome. How about Ed and Christy, if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and giving us a little brief introduction before we get started. We can do it again when we get to our full group, but that would be fabulous if you could introduce yourselves as well.
I can get started. I'm Ed Remus. I'm the social sciences librarian at Northeastern Illinois University. And in that capacity, I also provide research assistance to the history students and faculty at the university.
My name is Chrissy Cogswell. I am also one of the librarians at Northeastern Illinois University. I'm actually the librarian for one of our branch campuses, El Centros. So if you're ever around, stop by, say hi. Yeah, my kind of subject area specialty for my job is social work, but my undergrad and a master's degree in history. So history is something that I'm super passionate about and knowledgeable. So yeah, I think between Ed and I, you guys have access to like the best of the best history library NEIU folks. So yay, we're excited to be here.
We are so excited that they invited us back again because NEIU has been a fabulous partner to History Day researchers for many years. I am newly back at History Day after taking some years away from the program doing other things. So I am new. I am the manager of the History Day program. So please do reach out to me with any questions, teachers, students. We'll share all of our contact information through the course of the program today, but I'm still learning how things have been done these last several years as well. So it's been fabulous to have Ed and Chrissy talk about some of the recent things that they've been doing to support students. I'd also like to introduce my colleagues. I believe that Lily popped on as well, but I'm going to start with Lauren. Lauren, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Lauren Maley, and I am the History Learning Specialist with Chicago Metro History Day and the History Museum. I'm also new to this role, and I never even knew about History Day in school growing up until I learned about this job, and I was like, wait, what is this amazing program that's going on? And it's been a lot of fun to dive into History Day and see all of the projects that students can work on. And I'm thrilled to be able to, at least in some capacity, help you all with your research and your projects and developing your arguments. So I'm really excited and thank all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lauren. And Lily, I don't know if you are able to pop on with your video, but we have a new intern who literally just joined us this week. It was our first in-person day yesterday. So we're excited to have so many people who are excited to help you this year. So Lily, if you're out there and would like to make an introduction, go ahead and pop on.
Sure, yeah, good morning. My name is Lily. I am a student at UIC, and like Lauren, this is my first time hearing about Chicago Metro History Day. So I, along with, I assume most, will be learning a lot from this experience. So again, anything that I can do to help, I might not have the answers, but maybe I can direct you over to someone who might know the answers for you. All right, but thank you everyone for allowing me to join this session.
Great, fabulous. Well, my job here today is to sort of kick us off, and I don't want to speak too long because I want to save the vast majority of our time for our presenters today who are going to be helping us out. But I wanted to quickly just share my screen, give you a sense of what's happening this morning. Okay, so all right, so we've already done our introductions a bit, which is fabulous. Just wanted to remind you all of our National History Day theme, Debate and Diplomacy in History, Successes, Failures, Consequences. So we have been so delighted to see the topics that have rolled through so far. Some of you, we don't have your topics quite yet, and we look forward to learning what those are. I feel like this workshop is always like one of our favorites because this is one of of the first times that we as the staff members get to see all the cool stuff that you're working on, which is fabulous. So we've already introduced our partners here, but I wanted to also provide you their names. If you have a question for someone specific, we ask that you could put that into the chat, and we will either stop the presentation and discuss it at that time, if that's the most appropriate, or we may save them up until the question answer period at the end. And if you have a specific person that you would like to get this information from, please feel free to include their name in the chat, and we will be happy to follow up with you. We do have a lot of participants today. We have more than 100 people registered, which is fabulous, and we're so excited about that. But please do, we want this to be as interactive as possible, and we want to be as helpful as possible to all of you. So please do let us know what we can do to support you. Also, just a reminder, we are recording this event for people who may not be able to make it, or teachers who may need to share this kind of information with students who are out of school because of COVID or other reasons. So we ask that you do put your questions into the chat. So that just helps to assure your privacy and assure that we are keeping the focus on this content. So thanks for putting those questions in the chat. Brief introduction to the agenda for the day. We're starting now with some sort of welcome and introduction sorts of things, a few housekeeping duties of the day. But then we really get into the meat of things at 9:15. From 9:15 to about 10:30 or so, we're going to have our research workshop with our NEIU librarians and Chrissy. So that's going to be, I think, the thing that all of you are so very excited about today, because based on the questions that we got in our registration, we know that you're in the heart of your research now, and you're very excited to get some direction for the things that are coming up next for you. We're going to take a short break after the research workshop portion of the program, just to stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, get a drink, those sorts of things. And then next, we're going to have a historical thinking skills workshop with Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. And then we'll finish up with some wrap up around 11:05 to 11:15 or so. We are going to have our raffle prize during our raffle drawing during that time. So we ask that everyone put their first name and last initial and their school into the chat so that we can draw for our raffle towards the end of today's program. So again, that's right in the chat, your first name, your last initial, and your school, so that if you happen to be one of our raffle prize winners, we can get your raffle prize to you. And then from 11:15 to 11:30, or however long we need, we can go later than that if we need to. Please join us for a question and answer if there are specific questions that you have about the History Day process or about your topic or how to get coaching, and you just need more support. We are here for you as long as needed after that program. So please do join us for that question and answer period as well. Just for our students, want to just remind you of what our contest schedule is going to look like for this year. Some of this information has changed recently. We know our teachers are getting it out there to our students, but we wanted to just remind you of some of these changes as well. We are planning to have a hybrid contest this spring. We at the Chicago History Museum have a new requirement that all visitors to our programs who are over age 5 must be vaccinated. So for the students, judges, and guests who would like to attend our in-person contest, that will require proof of vaccination at the door. And those in-person contest dates are Saturday, March 12th for our junior division. That's grades 6 through 8. That's at the Chicago History Museum. Our senior division in-person contest will be March 16th. That's a Wednesday at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Both of those are the in-person contest where you must show vaccination. If you are not vaccinated, that is no problem at all. The students and judges who are not vaccinated will be asked to participate in our virtual History Day program, which your registration deadline for all of these programs will be March 3rd, but the actual judging for our virtual History Day will run from March 18th through the 25th. So again, registration is going to be on March 3rd, and these are the actual contest dates that are coming up. This next part is new news that our teachers don't even have yet. When we don't have all of the details either. We have a meeting on Monday to learn what those details are. But we did receive communication from the State History Day program that the state contest is going to need to turn into a virtual contest as well. That will happen towards the end of April. And we will get those details out as soon as we learn them. Like we said, we have a meeting next week with our state partners to learn more about that. The national contest will also be virtual. So, of course, all of you will first need to go through your school programs before these contests even begin, before you even get to the level of possibly being able to register for these. But we wanted to let you know sort of what the timeline for the spring looks like, because there's so much uncertainty right now with things in COVID that we wanted to just make sure that you knew that we are in fact having a contest. It will have both the in-person and the virtual elements that you can choose the one that's best for you. And we look forward to involving you. All right, I'm going to save that till later. I'm going to stop my share. All right. I can see so many names have flowed into the chat. That's awesome. We can't wait to draw our raffle prizes towards the end. I think with that, my partners, Lauren, Chrissy, Ed, Lily, are there any comments or questions before we begin with the research workshop? All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over. Ed and Chrissy, who should I make the next co-host to be able to share your screens? Chrissy first, okay. All right, you are now co-host, Chrissy.
Woo, awesome, thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. I'll introduce myself again. My name is Chrissy Cogswell. I'm one of the librarians at NEIU, Northeastern Illinois University. I am technically the social work librarian, but my own personal background is an undergrad and graduate degree in history. So definitely super knowledgeable, and very happy to be here today and sort of share this information. Does someone else have co-host privileges to sort of manage the waiting room? Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're not like leaving someone accidentally waiting. Excellent. Okay, so for today, I'm going to be kind of discussing how to begin your research and sort of begin looking for what we call secondary sources. And I'll explain a little bit what that means. My colleague Ed, who is also a NEIU librarian with us today, he will be covering the primary source section of the presentation. So the first thing I want to do is kind of plug our services. Let's go ahead and share my screen. We've got Google up. Is everyone seeing that? Beautiful. Okay. So the first thing I want to sort of direct everyone to is the Chicago History Day page. The reason that I'm showing you this, so it's that first link there, and I just Googled Chicago History Day. I want to show you kind of an important link if you'd like to schedule a time to meet with me or with Ed. Both of us are available to schedule virtual one-on-one research appointments. And so for the presentation today, you know, as you can imagine, everyone has a different topic. You know, everyone's topic's going to need different sources, different types of sources. And so we're going to keep it kind of general and show you just sort of the nuts and bolts of how some of this works. But I really, really want to encourage everybody to reach out, schedule an appointment with Ed or I. We are more than happy to meet with you, 30 minutes, a full hour, work specifically on your topic and kind of help you find keywords or discover sources and help you get the stuff you need for your project. So the way that you're going to find the link to schedule with us is you'll come to this Chicago History Day page. And then, oops, let me move this out of the way. All right, and then you're going to click on the students button. So this little square here, students, all right, excellent, that's you. We're gonna scroll down and this tab here, research page. Under this tab, you will find a little bit of information, and right here, available to meet one-on-one virtual research consultations. That's the link that you'll click to schedule an appointment with us. And so that'll bring you to a page that has some links, schedule with Ed, schedule with Chrissy. You can kind of choose your appointment time, enter your email address. I think it does need to be a non-CPS email address, so heads up on that. But once you've scheduled that, we'll have your appointment on our schedule and we can kind of go from there. Okay. The other nice thing about this site, and thank you Chicago History Day folks for putting all of this excellent information together, we do have a resource directory here. And so some of the tools that I'm going to be going over are listed here. I will kind of show you how to navigate to each of the tools just from Google to try to make it a little easier. I'm also going to copy and paste the URLs of all of these sites into the chat, so you've got them too. Want to make sure that you've got multiple ways to kind of find the information that you need. Okay, excellent. So I think we are good there. Also wanted to pause, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. We're going to be pausing for questions after my presentation on secondary sources, but also after Ed's presentation on primary sources. So please, if you've got questions, jot them down. We can definitely get answers for you just at the end of the presentation. So excellent. All right. So that is sort of how you find the link to get in touch with us. Okay. So let's talk about sources. The first thing, well, let's Google. The first thing I want to sort of discuss is this difference between a primary source and a secondary source, and sort of what does that mean, right? So a primary source is something that was written or made or created by people who were alive when the historical event was happening. And so we consider that a primary source because those are people that are living in that time and they don't have, 50 years to look back and sort of think about those events, right? This is their lives and this is actually happening. And so Ed's going to kind of go over how to find primary sources online. But for my presentation, we will be looking at secondary sources. So when we talk about secondary sources, if a primary source is kind of created when the event is happening, a secondary source is created after the fact. And so the secondary sources are going to generally be like a textbook or a history book or a documentary. So these are all things that were created about the historical event, but written after the event happened by people that were not present when the event was happening. So we've got a little bit of kind of time and distance to think about that event and think about why it was important or what it led to or what changes it caused. If you're living during an event, you don't necessarily know what changes that event is going to cause or whether or not it's important or whether or not people in the future will think it's important, right? If you're writing about something that happened 50 years ago, you have a pretty good idea about whether or not this is something that, is still considered important or affected policies, after it happened. So a secondary source is going to kind of analyze the historical event, if that makes sense. So how do we find secondary sources? Sort of where do we start, right? I always like to say, like, we don't know what we don't know until we don't know it. And so to that end, I actually recommend if you've chosen a topic that maybe you know a few things about, but you don't really know, all of the things, maybe when it happened, why it was important, those sorts of things. A really, really good place to start is actually Wikipedia. And I'm kind of laughing because I know Wikipedia gets a bad rap, and there are lots of problems with it. So I want to make sure that you understand kind of those issues and those problems. But Wikipedia can be a really, really good tool to use as long as you kind of know how to use it. As long as you know walking in sort of the questions that you're going to have to ask and the additional work that you're going to need to do to sort of make sure that that information is good. Wikipedia can be a really nice sort of encyclopedia summary of your event to help you sort of learn about your event. Okay, so for my example, I'm going to choose the Great Chicago Fire because we all know about it and it is easy. So there we are. So Wikipedia, right? So I just Googled Great Chicago Fire Wikipedia, and here's the article. Okay, so I'm positive everybody's looked at Wikipedia before, so I don't really need to explain much, but generally this section up here will sort of give you a summary, and then the sections below obviously are going to explain different aspects of that event that contributed, sometimes the aftermath, things like that. And so this information is really good because you can, get an idea kind of a summary of the event. You also can pick out important dates and important names. So if there's a particular person or a particular maybe government office that was that was involved in your event, those can become keywords as you search in different places, right? So as you're reading through Wikipedia, you can kind of keep a notebook and jot down kind of important people, places, and things, right? That might turn into keywords kind of in your next steps. The additional nice thing about Wikipedia is technically everyone who enters information on Wikipedia needs to provide a citation for that information. You'll notice these little citations, footnotes down here. So those will bring you to this list of resources at the bottom, or references, they call it. I'm going to be honest, I wouldn't use these references. I wouldn't use these links. I actually probably wouldn't use any of the information that I get from Wikipedia directly. Any information that you find on Wikipedia, you're going to want to find that same information, that same fact kind of published in a more reputable source. And so the way Wikipedia works is anyone is able to go in and edit anything and add anything, right? And so we don't necessarily want to trust the information exactly from Wikipedia, but it can give us a general summary. These citations down here can be helpful if there are specific books maybe that you could find at a local library. Don't trust whoever it is that said that this book has this piece of information. Go and get this book and find that piece of information yourself. But this can be a really nice sort of launching off point if you just are not really sure kind of where to get started with your topic. So that is my spiel on Wikipedia. I hope I both excited you about using Wikipedia since it's an easy source, but also cautioned you to be careful about it and, be a smart researcher. That's what you have to do. You have to put on your critical thinking cap and really think about the information and think about who's writing the information so that you make sure that you verify anything that you're including in your project. Excellent. All right. So the next place I want to talk about, and I sort of talked about this with the references down below, is if you find a piece of information on Wikipedia that really just is great and you are excited and you want to sort of get an idea of whether or not it's real or true, the next best place to go for secondary sources is going to be your local library. So I'm going to go ahead and look for the Chicago Public Library page. Obviously, I'm here in Chicago, so the public library is the biggest system for me. But if you are coming from the suburb schools, There might be a local library closer to you. Just go ahead and kind of search your town's name and then public library, and you should find it. All library sites are going to look a little different, but they all function in basically the same way. So I'm going to click on Chicago Public Library up here, and I am brought to the Chicago Public Library website. The first thing I'm going to want to look for is a search bar, because I'm going to want to find books. I'm going to want to search. So on CPL's website, that search bar is right up here, and I'm going to click on that, and it's going to reveal sort of all of the different options. It is automatically set to search the catalog, which is great because I am looking for books, and the information about books are stored in library catalogs. So this is perfect. And keyword is perfect just because I'm going to search with just sort of a beginning keyword, but you can search by title or author or subject. So if you have additional information about a resource that you're looking for, you can kind of modify those options to find it a little bit more directly. But I'm going to keep it keyword, and I'm going to do just Great Chicago Fire. Okay, so one thing that I'm just going to sort of mention here, the title of this event, right? The way that we understand when we talk about this event, we call it the Great Chicago Fire, right? That is one name that is referring to one event that happened in 1871, right? But there have been lots of fires in Chicago. And so I want to make sure that I'm only finding things that talk about the Great Chicago Fire. They have those 3 words in that order, only Great Chicago Fire, right? I don't want to find a book that has Chicago on page 2 and the word fire on page 55. I want to find books about the Great Chicago Fire. So the way that I can do that is if I put those 3 words in quotations, that'll tell the system to only find me those exact words. Don't kind of split them up, only find me those 3 words in that order. Excellent. All right, so now that I have my search kind of ready to go, I'm just going to press search. Okay. So we've got some results. Looks like I've got 103 results, so not a huge amount, but probably more than I necessarily need right now. So let's go ahead and see if we can add some limiters on the left-hand side here to sort of zero in on what we're looking for. So I know that I'm interested in a book. There are some other formats here. For example, there's also some mixed material. There's also an audio book. And so by saying I'm only interested in books, that means that I will only see these 73 books that are in these results. So excellent, I'm down to 75, that's perfect. Okay, so other ways that I can kind of limit this content. Over here, this audience filter on the Chicago Public Library site is useful. So Chicago Public Library has, content for 2-year-olds. It also has content for 100-year-olds. So you want to make sure that you're kind of finding the right types of materials, right? So I would recommend searching the adult kind of audience. So let's go ahead and limit there. Okay, we're down to 64. The next place that you can look to sort of limit that works out nicely is the topic. So all of these books are going to have different sort of tags, different topics. You'll notice there are 2 for the Great Chicago Fire. Oh, 3 for the Great Chicago Fire. And so any of these, if you click on them, you will find materials that are useful. I'm going to click on this first one because it has the most, 38. Okay, so we're down to 38 now, and now I'm going to take a look at my results. And so any of these books would be considered, you should consider them, they would work. You can go ahead and place the hold. You can have them sent to your local library. You do have to log in with your library card, but have them sent to your local library and you can pick them up. I know generally this series of books has a lot of really great local titles. So just a recommendation, if you're looking for your subject and you see a book with this cover, they do a good job. But any of those books would work for you. All right, so that's kind of generally looking for books using the CPL website. I am going to transition now to secondary sources journal articles. And so the Chicago Public Library, again, this search was searching the catalog. I'm actually going to search the Chicago Public Library for a database. And so the way I'm going to do that is just go back to the Chicago Public Library. There it is, it's loading. All right, so here we are back at that home page. I'm going to check this search again. And instead of searching the catalog, I'm not looking for books anymore. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for a link to a website on this website. So I'm going to search the website, all content, and the word I'm going to search is just Jstor, and it's J-S-T-O-R. And I'm going to press enter. All right. Let's see if I can be logged in. Uh-oh. I'm going to unshare real quick. Sorry, it logged me off on a new browser. Let me unshare my screen, log in, and then get back. Uh-oh. Sorry, got two monitors and everything's kind of hidden. Are you seeing my screen right now or no? Ooh, Crystal,
Yeah. Do you want me to unshare for you?
Yeah, if you could. Oh, I just see. There it is. Okay, found it. I apologize. All right, one moment, please. Thank you for your patience. It's like the biggest fear of all of us presenting online is something not going the way that we thought it was going to.
My biggest fear of presenting online is my cat walking across my keyboard and somehow ending the meeting. You try so hard. You wake up early, you get all logged in, everything's great, and then share your screen and it just did not work. Okay. There we are.
Just a reminder, everyone, if you joined us a little bit later, for our students, we're asking everyone to put your name, your first name and last initial and your school name into our chat. We are going to have a raffle at the end of the day today, so we would like to include everyone. So again, students, first name, last initial, and school. If you're a teacher, please also put your name into the chat and your school into the chat, because we have a separate raffle for our teachers.
All right, thank you so much for your patience. All right, so again, I searched the Chicago Public Library website for the word Jstor, J-S-T-O-R. So Jstor is a database, and it's full of academic journal articles. And so academic journal articles are they're kind of like magazine articles that are published by academics. So these are written by historians. They are secondary sources. They're written, I mean, even today they're publishing. So someone writing about the Great Chicago Fire, that's going to be a secondary source because it happens after the fact. And so Jstor is a really wonderful place to sort of read historical interpretation and analysis of various historical events. It is a paid service. And so, if you just sort of Googled Jstor, J-S-T-O-R, and went to the site, it would very quickly try to charge you money to download articles. The Chicago Public Library, though, thankfully, during COVID has opened up the access to this database to anybody with a public library card from their home, which is really exciting. So here I am again on the Chicago Public Library website. I found Jstor, so I'm going to click on it. I did log in, as everyone knows. All right, so here we are, Jstor. That little icon there is letting you know that you do need a library card to access it, but I am logged in, so that's wonderful. Click on the link. Here I am at Jstor. Okay, so just like the CPL website, the thing that I'm going to look for on this database is a search bar. And in this search bar, I'm going to enter some keywords. So I have primarily used Great Chicago Fire as my keyword for this search. I could absolutely do that here. I could put it inside quotations to search for those 3 words in that order exactly. All of those tricks would work, but you're more than welcome to try different keywords. And so one way that you can kind of play with keywords is called Boolean searching. And so it's sort of ways that you can tell the database how you want it to search for information. So I'm going to sort of show you one way to do this just with this topic. So I'm going to begin just with the word Chicago, and then I'm going to put in a capital A-N-D. The thing that does is it tells the database, I only want to see results that have the first word, Chicago, and the second word, whatever it is that I'm going to put in. I only want to find things that have those 2 things. I don't want to find anything that doesn't have any of those words. And so we're going to say Chicago and let's say fire and hit enter. Okay, excellent. So here we are on our results page. The first thing that you're going to see on Jstor is they've got some photos. You are more than welcome to look through these. Any of the objects or images or things that you find on Jstor are going to be a reputable kind of academic source. So anything that you find on here should be good. So you would click view all images. Those are, again, going to be primary sources. So for secondary sources, you're going to kind of scroll down, and here we are in our sort of results. So we've got some book chapters, we've got a journal article. If I continued scrolling down, it wouldn't shock me if I found different things, reviews, things like that. And so for my search, I'm only interested in finding journal articles. So the way that I kind of do that is over here on the left-hand side, just like the CPL website, I'm going to add a couple filters. So the first one I'm going to add is journals. Let's only see journal articles, right? So there we go, some journal articles. You can also, if you are interested, kind of focus a little bit closer. Oops, what did I just do? A little closer on your topic by limiting by subject. So for this search, I would probably see if I could just say history, and there it is, history, right? So this is 35,000 results, which is a ton. So I might try to add additional keywords here just to sort of make it a little bit more manageable. So let's see if maybe adding a date, that's going to be 18. We're going to say maybe legislation is something that you're interested in. Okay, now we're down to 5,000. And so as you sort of go through your process, you can add and subtract keywords just to find different things. The additional thing that you can sort of, you can kind of do in a database is, let's say this is an article, let's say fire safety is something that you're interested in. And this is an example of an article that you're interested in. So, okay, I clicked on it. Here I am at the metadata page. So the first thing to kind of be aware of is when was this article published? 2003. So that's pretty okay. Sometimes you do find articles that were published, 1905, and maybe those are going to be a little bit more challenging, but 2003, I say use it as a secondary source. You're also going to have this download button here. So this is how you're actually going to download the article. And let's go, and here's the citation. So you can download a citation. I haven't played around with Jstor's citation generator, but that should help you kind of get started with your citations. If you're looking to email yourself a link to the article so you can come back later, this stable URL is the one to use. Don't copy and paste this one. Grab that one. It'll make sure you get back to the article that you want.
Christy, we have a question from the audience that might be good to answer now rather than later.
Absolutely.
Cynthia wants to know, could you please show where it indicates primary versus secondary? I missed that. Could you talk a little bit more about how a student would find that and understand that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So primary source, so primary and secondary, right, are kind of the two types of historical sources. So a good way to think about it is primary sources are going to be anything that was sort of created or written by someone who was actually alive when the event was happening. And so, you know, it might be photos, it might be letters, it might be diary entries, you know, obviously like newspaper articles that are published after an event. Those are all considered primary sources, right? They are written and created by people who were alive when the event was happening. A secondary source is going to be something that was created by an individual who was not alive when the event was happening. So, for instance, some of these articles are written 2014, that first one. That person definitely wasn't alive when the Chicago fire happened in 1871. That's a really easy way of kind of determining whether you're looking at a primary or a secondary source generally. The idea behind a secondary source is they are going to analyze that historical event from the future, basically. So if someone is alive while the event is happening, they don't necessarily know how that event is going to sort of change the future, right? They don't necessarily know when the Great Chicago Fire happened. If you were alive at that period, you didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know if Chicago was going to come back. You didn't know if we were, you know, ever going to be a big city again. And so when you write about it, your perspective is going to be different than someone living 100 years later who can look back on that event and say, this was an important event for these reasons. This event led to these changes, right? And so it's really kind of that distance and the ability to kind of analyze the event that really sort of makes the difference between kind of a primary source and a secondary source. But to sort of give you an easy answer to that question, an easy way to sort of tell the difference between a primary and a secondary source is asking yourself, was this thing created by somebody who was alive when the event was happening? Or was this thing created by somebody who was not alive when that thing was happening? I hope that answers the question. Please let me know.
Yeah, thanks for going into a little bit more depth about the distinction between those. The original author wrote that she thought that they were indicated on the site as primary versus secondary. The only clue is really the date, right? So
yeah, and
there's
also
not a button that tells you that.
Unfortunately, no. You know, you will probably find some websites that talk about like primary source collections and things that use the words and kind of help you out a bit. But as far as kind of coming to the research, the other kind of side of that is that, you know, oftentimes the type of material that you're working with will sort of help you know whether or not it's primary or secondary. And so like, you know, a photo of the destruction would be a primary source, but a textbook that talks about the fire, that would be a secondary source. So textbooks, books, journal articles, those sorts of documentaries, those sorts of things are just pretty much always going to be secondary sources, whereas like objects and photos and letters and diaries and things like that, those are pretty much always going to be kind of primary. So that might help too.
Thank you for going into more depth about that. Lauren also in the chat gave a few more tips about filtering, and I know we're going to get into that more when we get to Ed here soon, so I don't want to steal those things away, but thank you for answering the immediate question for those who are watching.
Absolutely, yeah. So, so I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the research, the Chicago the Chicago History Day research page that has the contact for Ed and I to schedule appointments. Again, one-on-one research consultations, they're free. Let us know, we'll meet with you. And then I'll copy the CPL and the Jstor links into the chat. But that kind of finishes the secondary source portion of our presentation today, and I will break for a couple of moments for questions, and then Ed, feel free to take it over.
Thanks, Chrissy. I am seeing this one question here. The questioner asks, I am researching a topic with multiple names. How would I search for that topic with all of those names? I don't know if you'd want to take a stab at that, Chrissy, but I guess what I would, yeah, maybe go ahead, Chrissy, if you want to take a stab at that.
You know, that's a really great question. And Ed, I don't know if that's something, maybe a search that you can work into primary sources, because the way that you would set up the search would look essentially the same, regardless of whether or not you were searching for primary or secondary. But that might be a good kind of exemplar for us to play around with for the primary searches, if that works, Ed, so they don't take up any more time.
That sounds good. I think I can integrate that into our into our next segment here, which is focused on finding primary sources. I guess let me give a short answer, and then I think I'll try to come back around to it, which is you'd simply want to search for each name, I think, essentially, although there may be a way to set up an advanced search where you search for different iterations of the name. But what you might want to try to do, at least the kind of long way to do it, is to search for each variation of the name within each resource that you're searching. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let me change the view. I just want to make sure that for the recording, I'm not showing everyone who's in here. So, okay. Okay, you should all now be able to see my screen. And I have there are four main things I'd like to show you today. First, I'd like to show you how to find books that contain primary sources. This will be not very useful for many of you, but extremely useful for some of you. Secondly, I want to show you how to find newspaper articles from the time of the event. This will be useful for almost all of you. Thirdly, I want to show you how to find brick and mortar archives in Chicago that may contain primary sources useful to your topic. This will be useful for many, but not all of you. Essentially, those of you studying Chicago topics, this will be very useful. And then finally, something I think everyone will appreciate, I will show you how to search some digital archives for audiovisual materials, as well as text and documents. So like Chrissy, I'm going to start out here at the research page. So if you're not here already, I think Chrissy put a link to this page in the chat. So this is, again, just a wonderful compilation of resources that you can all use. First, we have Chicago or Illinois portals and digital collections. So if you have a Chicago or Illinois topic, these will be great resources for you. And we have national portals to primary sources and digital collections. And then we have audiovisual resources online, as well as special collections and archives. So I'm going to be jumping around this a little bit to highlight a few different resources. But the very first thing I want to show you is something just a little bit extra that's actually not on this list. It's called Worldcat, and I'm going to go ahead and just quickly paste it in the chat. Worldcat, you may be wondering, okay, I've searched maybe my school library catalog, or I've searched my public library catalog. It shows me a certain limited list of books, but how do I search the library catalogs of the entire world? How do I know the full scope of all the books that are out there, right? Well, for that, you'd want to use Worldcat. Worldcat shows you everything, essentially. As you can see here, it connects you to the collections and services of more than 10,000 libraries worldwide. So that includes the Chicago Public Library, but it goes beyond it. Why am I showing you that? Well, your public library is a wonderful place to start, right, to find books. But sometimes, especially if you're searching a more specific topic, there may be certain specialized books that are out there in the world that may not immediately come up when you search your public library collection. Now, most books that you find, as Chrissy mentioned, will be secondary sources, but there is a particular genre of book that will be very useful to some of you when it comes to finding primary sources. And that is a book that contains primary sources, a book that has been edited and compiled, typically by historians, to contain and contextualize and highlight some of the most important primary source documents for a given topic. So before this presentation today, I took a look at some of the topics that you all had submitted that you're working with, and I noticed that many of you were researching the Haitian Revolution. So I just want to show you quickly here in WorldCat, what if we do a search, as Chrissy mentioned, we can put this in quotation marks because it's a distinct phrase, Haitian Revolution, right? And we search for books. Well, we're going to get a lot of different books on the Haitian Revolution. Most of these are going to be secondary sources, books about the Haitian Revolution. But what if we type in an additional keyword? Let's try Haitian Revolution documents. Haitian Revolution documents. Okay, and then we get this really interesting primary source, the Haitian Revolution, a documentary history. Well, we see that's an ebook. We might, those can be a little bit tricky to access if they're offered by another library. Typically, ebooks are only available to the users of the library that owns that ebook. So I'm going to click on View All Formats and Languages, and I'm going to go down here to the print book, right? I'm going to go down here to the print version of this book. And I see that this is a landmark collection of documents by the field's leading scholar. This book contains beautifully written introductions and a fascinating array of never before published primary documents, right? These treasures from the archives offer a new picture of colonial Saint-Domingue in the Haitian Revolution. The translations are lively and colorful, right? So if we scroll down, we can actually see some of the interesting primary sources. We get a timeline, we get a map, but then we get all of these really interesting primary sources on the Haitian Revolution, right? Now, why does this exist for the Haitian Revolution? Well, it's hard to say exactly, but it's an older topic and historians have been studying it for a long time, right? So I noticed that, for example, some of you may be researching the early 1990s LA riots, or the Chicago Teachers Union strike of, say, I think it was 1987. Well, that's probably not going to have a collection of primary source documents that was published by a book that was edited by a historian, right? A book like this probably won't exist for those topics. They're a little bit recent. But for some older topics, and especially topics that are just considered very recognized, that scholars have been studying for a long time, you can often find these primary source collections. So, again, there are a few ways you could search for this, and I don't want to limit you to one. So you could try, Haitian Revolution primary sources, right? And the book will come up. Haitian Revolution documents, right? Just sort of using some keywords after your topical keyword to indicate here that you're looking for a book like this. Again, it won't always exist, but sometimes it will. Let me give you another example. Women's suffrage. I noticed that some of you will be searching for that. Again, if we search for women's suffrage, we're going to find a lot of different books about that. But what if we type in women's suffrage documents? Okay, we see there are some primary documents here. We see that this is a reader in documents and essays from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That could be interesting. What if we try primary sources? Right, okay. Primary source investigation of women's suffrage, that's interesting. Voting rights in America, a primary documents in context, right? There was, and I'm not sure if it was here or maybe I had used, okay, this could be really good too. Women's suffrage, a primary source, history of the women's rights movement in America, right? So again, we can click on view all formats and languages. I'm doing that because I see it's an ebook. I click on this, I scroll down, and then I see that this does indeed, this looks like it's a children's book, but it does use primary, I see here it uses primary source documents. So this can be an interesting way to find, and if we were to scroll down we could find maybe some other books that would be relevant. This can be an interesting way to find primary source documents. Now, to go back to the Haitian Revolution example, right? How would I get this book, right? We know that it's a Haitian Revolution, a documentary history. Let's say I'm a Chicago Public Library user. I can go to Chicago Public Library. I could search for it in the Chicago Public Library catalog. See if it comes up. And it turns out it doesn't. So what could we do in this case, right? I may have introduced a spelling error there. But even so, no results, right? No results. I'm not seeing that specific book. So what could I do? Well, your public library will have something called Interlibrary Loan. And Interlibrary Loan is a service that allows your library to request for you a book that exists at some other library, like this one. So what you can do is search for Chicago Public Library Interlibrary Loan. And I'm going to just go ahead and paste this in the chat. I won't really get into the details of this, but if you follow these instructions here, you could also just call or visit your library and ask a librarian about this process. But if you identify a book that is not available at your library, you can request it through your library. And again, that can be great for primary source collections, documentary source readers like this one. So that's, again, this will be really useful for some of you, not as useful for others, but I just want to point out that this is out there. Now, the second type of resource that I want to show you today is newspapers. And so again, if we go back to the research page for the Chicago Metro History Day, if we scroll down, you can see that, a lot of particular resources are offered here. You'll see that under the Chicago Public Library, there's a particular way, if you visit the site, I'm going to show you that right now, there's a particular way to visit one of their most helpful newspaper sources, which is the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. So I'm going to go to Browse Online Resources. That is an online resource. And they have this helpful link, A to Z resources. So if you want to see all of the resources that the Chicago Public Library offers digitally, where you can basically sign in with your library card and access the resource online, that's right here. Oh, I'm sorry. That's actually the wrong one. Right here, A to Z resources. So what I'm going to do is scroll down and find the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. Notice one thing I want to point out is there are many other interesting newspaper archives here. For example, the Chicago Defender Historical Archive could be a great source for many of you. Nationally significant African American newspaper that ran from 1910. Well, here it has the runnings from 1910 to 2010. I believe it's still in publication, but the particular newspaper I mentioned that'll be useful for many of you is the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. So this is the full digital contents of the Chicago Tribune from 1849 to 2012. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link and paste it in the chat so you all can join me here. If you are Chicago Public Library card members, please go ahead and log in. I'm just going to quickly log in just because I'm a little more familiar with it through my own university's library website, which is NEIU Libraries here. So if you excuse me for just a second, Chicago Tribune, we have basically, whoops, here it is. We have basically the same thing, Chicago Tribune Historical. Okay, so when you log in, you'll see something like this. Now, you'll see this home page, right, where you can do a basic search, and then you have options to do an advanced search. Now, I noticed that you were, some of you were researching the Lager Beer Riot in Chicago. And so, so I did a search for Lager Beer Riot. And, interestingly, I didn't find that much. I'm thinking, wow, just from the title of this topic, right, it sounds like this is a pretty major event. Students are researching it. It's called a riot. It took place here in Chicago. Why aren't there more primary sources here in the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive that are covering the Lager Beer riot, right? I see that, you know, these sources are spanning from all different dates, right? From, you know, 1860s, 1870s, 1970s, 1920s. I'm not quite sure what to make of this result set, right? So when in doubt, this is sort of an opportunity that I wanted to use to kind of show you all how you might be able to overcome some roadblocks in your research, right? What you might want to do, if your first set of keywords doesn't work, try reading about your topic. Try getting a little bit more of a sense of it, and let that inspire you to try some different keywords when you're searching these primary source databases, right? You don't always want to attack the subject head on, right? Sometimes you search for Haitian Revolution and you get just what you need, right? Like we did before. But other times you might have to try some different searches, right? To find information on that topic. Maybe you research the Haitian Revolution, you learn about Toussaint Louverture as an actor in that historical event, that historical process, and you decide to search for Toussaint Louverture instead of Haitian Revolution, right? And maybe you get some more sources that way. So I did the same thing here for Lager Beer Riot, right? I first went to Wikipedia, and then I remembered, you know, I kind of read this article. Then I remember this is a Chicago topic. So actually went to another great resource, which is the Encyclopedia of Chicago. And I searched for Lager Beer Riot. And so, and it turns out there's an article on it here. Just in case, you know, some of you might not be familiar, this is, if you're doing a Chicago related topic, this is a wonderful secondary source, and it can really help you to also find some background information as you're doing primary source searches. So what I learned here from the Encyclopedia of Chicago is that this took place in 1855. And also it took place around the new city council majority hiking liquor license fees. So I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. I tried a direct search for Lager Beer Riot. That didn't help me find any newspaper articles here in the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive, but I know the date now, right? I know the year, it's 1855, and I kind of know the what. You know, I not only what this event was called, but I know what it was about, liquor license fees. So I tried a different tack. I tried just to search for liquor here in the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. Now, maybe unsurprisingly, if you know Chicago's history or culture, okay, like over 200,000 search results. But we're looking for those that are specifically about the Lager Beer Riot, right, and something that might have to do with that. So it's probably published in the year of that riot, 1855. So on the left-hand side here, you know, just like Chrissy pointed out, there are a lot of ways to limit your search results, right? And whenever you're searching any kind of website for primary or secondary sources, any kind of database or catalog, always think about how can you use those limiting tools, those refining tools, to limit your search results, and what would be the tool most appropriate, right? Well, here, since we know that this event had a very delimited date, 1855, let's see if we can find you know, maybe we could look for newspaper articles from that month, but at the very least that year, right? So I'm going to click on enter a date range, and I'm going to say 1855 to 1855. Let's just see if we can get a sense from the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive what was happening in Chicago related to liquor in the year 1855 that could help us make sense of or tell a story about the Lager Beer Riot. And then, as it turns out, there are a lot of really interesting sources here, right? We see liquor, looks like a spelling error there, but, you know, liquor without license, and so on. Now, we're also seeing a little bit of a snapshot of the date. Now, if I go back to Encyclopedia of Chicago, I see this took place on April 21st. So if I wanted to get a sense of maybe the lead up to the Lager Beer Riot, I could look at this article from April 16th. And of course, this is great because you get the actual full text here. You may have to zoom in a little bit and do a little bit of detective work to see if you can make sense of the print, which is sometimes a little bit blurry. But this is also great, you know, for those of you doing documentaries, you can actually capture these images, right? You know, the headlines of articles, the titles and headlines and subtitles of articles can be really interesting to throw in your documentaries as images. And then, of course, this is a great source of text and information as well. And then, you know, we can, if we wanted to, we could even look for those published within the month of April. I think that, okay, yeah, 19 records from April. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm down to 19 results, right? And then I'm seeing, okay, this is interesting. Another rally of the rummies, anti-liquor law meeting at Market Hall, right? And so we can scroll down and read all about newspaper coverage of this meeting. And, you know, I see at the bottom, it says the remarks were in the German language for at least one of the speakers, which is maybe unsurprising because, you know, if I read this article here in Encyclopedia of Chicago, I learned that there was a lot of German and Irish protest against these liquor laws, right? So now, obviously, we don't have a lot of time, so I just searched a very specific topic here, right? But I just want to point out there are a lot of wonderful tools here you can use in the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. There's also an advanced search, right? So, you know, others of you I know are studying the Chicago Teachers Union, the Chicago Public Schools strike. You know, so if you wanted information about that, right, you could type in Chicago Teachers Union and strike, right? And we can see a lot of different articles covering strikes. And then if we had a particular year in mind, right, we could choose 1987, you know, for example, 1987, and we can get a much smaller set of results, 125, that would have to do with the strike. Now, one thing I want to point out, right, because not all of you are doing Chicago topics, not all of you are doing topics, you know, that are post 18, when does this begin? I think 1849, 1840, yeah, 1849, right? So for those of you researching topics that happened after 1849, and especially in Chicago, this particular newspaper, Chicago Tribune, will be especially relevant to you. But keep in mind, there are other newspaper sources available to you through the Chicago Public Library. Chronicling America offers a lot of historic as well as more contemporary newspaper sources that you could use to study everything from, you know, the Haitian Revolution and women's suffrage all the way through, you know, the LA riots of the early 1990s, right? So I just want to point out, you want to, if you're looking for newspaper sources, you know, look through here. Look through the A to Z resources from the Chicago Public Library and see if you can identify some different news sources that may be relevant for you, right? Illinois newspapers, Illinois newsstand, but certainly one of the most one-size-fits-all sources for you all to find primary sources will be the Chicago Tribune Historical Archive. Now, I want to jump next to the topic of how to find archives, brick and mortar archives in the Chicago area that would have resources for your topic. Now, again, this is especially relevant to those of you who are doing a Chicago related topic, right? Not always, but often the primary source documents, the archival holdings pertaining to a topic will be located in archives that are near sort of the site of that historical topic, right? Like where it happened. That's not always the case, but oftentimes. And so for Chicago history, a lot of the actual paper, physical primary source documents that you can get your hands on that have to do with Chicago history, a lot of them are located in archives here in Chicago. You know, so for those of you who are here in Chicago researching Chicago history, that means there are a lot of great primary sources right at your fingertips. Those of you who may be researching more distant topics like the Chinese Civil War or Haitian Revolution, some of the best brick and mortar archives for those topics may be in places like Haiti or China. Maybe not, but oftentimes. And so you may want to rely more on digital archives, right? But if you do have a Chicago topic especially, there are some great resources here in Chicago. And really the single greatest portal for you to figure out, is there a brick and mortar archive here in Chicago that has physical primary source documents that I can go to and look at and touch, you know, about my topic? The single greatest portal to figure that out, where those sources might be, is Explore Chicago Collections. So this is listed here. Again, on this page, the Chicago Metro History Day research page. So I'm going to open it here. It looks like this, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in the chat so you all can follow me here. Yes, and I see Crystal has some really helpful information. Be aware that most archives and special collections have special hours and COVID restrictions, especially right now. Be sure to contact them before you schedule an on-site research visit. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Crystal. That's very important. And at the end, I'll show you very quickly how you might begin that process. So again, especially if you have a Chicago-related topic here, and you might want to search Explore Chicago Collections. I'm going to say Chicago. You can see my search history is coming up. I searched for this already, so I know that it works. Chicago Teachers Union. So I'm going to do a search for that. And we see right away, we get some results. Now, I want to show you a little bit about what these results are and are not. It's a little bit misleading because they want to be user-friendly on this website. So they give you some images right away. So you might think, okay, I should use this website, right, to find the primary sources. They're going to be digital right here in the site, right? And if I don't find what I'm looking for, then I should move on. That's actually not the case here, right? Because what this website is actually a directory to show you which archival holdings, which actual institutions, places you can go to here in Chicago, will have archives related to your topic, right? And so it's not about giving you the sources right here. It's about showing you where you can go in Chicago to get the sources. So that's why you see, for example, on the left-hand side, libraries and archives is coming up right away. We see there are only 2 digital images. We're seeing them right here. Most of our search results are actually archival collections, 36. And those 36 archival collections span all of these different institutions: Chicago History Museum, University of Illinois at Chicago, University of Chicago, right? So let's see if we can figure out, if we're researching the Chicago public schools strike undertaken by the Chicago Teachers Union in 1987, where would we go to find physical paper primary source documents related to that strike? So that's why I did the search for Chicago Teachers Union, right? You might want to keep the searches here a little bit general, focus on an institution or a person. You could search for events as well. And then this is really interesting. I see the first one is related to the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike. Well, that's a little specific. That's not quite what we're looking for, right? But then I see, this is interesting, Chicago Teachers Union records. So the actual records of the union, including meeting minutes and agendas, correspondence reports, financial information, publications, clippings, all kinds of materials for mass distribution, all kinds of really interesting records. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere, right? So I'm going to click on that, and I see that this is located at the Chicago History Museum. So again, what this is telling me is that there's a physical collection of primary source documents located at the Chicago History Museum. There's all these records, but how do I know if they have anything on the 1987 teacher strike? I don't yet, right? I know that this collection of records spans, the date range includes 1987, right? Because this is 1870 to 2017, but I don't really know. So notice if we scroll down here, there are a lot of different options we have to learn more about this collection. Restrictions, terms governing use, provenance statement, that's sort of where it came from, different formats, how to cite it, the summary of the collection, that's interesting, historical note, okay, related material, useful, processing note, control access, all right, some different keywords, what it's about. But then we get to these 2 really interesting ones down here. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because whenever you're searching for primary source documents, looking to actually visit a brick and mortar archive in Chicago, pay attention to these 2 headings in particular: organization and arrangement of collection, and inventory. These contain a lot of really helpful pieces of information, right? So we see the different boxes in this collection. These are physical boxes that are located at the Chicago History Museum. And I see that, they're organized according to all these different types of materials. So that's interesting. So I'm starting to get the lay of the land of this collection. But finally, we have inventory, and this is really interesting. So we see this is a really big inventory of, box by box. What does this collection contain? Well, I'm going to do a Control F search to find something here, and I'm going to see if there's anything from 1987. And indeed, I see that 1987 is coming up with a few different results. And let's see, financial documents. Let me also try strike. Okay, and I'm seeing that strike action is coming up here in a few of these different boxes, right? CTU strikes, events, elections, and other materials. So I see strike information and other plans from 1969. That's interesting. And so this is telling me that this collection does include material from the 1987 strike action, right? So I'm using Control F. I'm kind of opening, again, opening the these last two here, right? Inventory and organization and arrangement of collection, using Control F to find specific things. Now, I want to wrap up here pretty quickly, but there's one more thing that's really important for you all to see, which is digital archives. So I'm going to go back to this main page here, and I just very quickly want to show you how could you find some digital archival materials on your topic. For many of you, this will actually be the single most important resource. So I'm going to, there's a particular source here that's listed called the Digital Public Library of America. And so I want to show you that. That's probably the single most comprehensive resource here. I'm going to open it in a new tab. Probably the single most comprehensive resource in terms of finding primary sources on the web. So just to go back, for example, to that earlier topic that can be a little bit tricky, because I know I've been focusing on more recent topics on Chicago. So let's go back to Haitian Revolution, right? Let's do a search for Haitian Revolution in the Digital Public Library of America. And we see that we get actually a lot of really interesting documents, right? Now you want to pay attention as you look through these results, ask yourself, who wrote them? When were they published? And so on. But we're seeing some really interesting, letters from 1793 that we could actually, read. This is pretty striking, especially for those of you who are doing documentaries. Now, my French is a little bit rusty, but I think I think this is saying something like, I'm equal to you, color is nothing, the heart is everything, are you not my brother? I think that's something, I think this says something like that, right? So a really interesting visual from the Haitian Revolution. So for those of you doing documentaries, for example, this would be a great source to, to think about. And so let's see, some other possible searches we could do here, right? I know that some of you are doing, again, more kind of topics more global in scope, like the Second World War. So we could search for Second World War. And you'll get a real wealth of resources here if this happens to be your topic. Again, on the left-hand side, you can expand some of these filters. We could look at different collections. So this is fascinating. American war posters from the Second World War, German poster and broadside collection, chiefly from the Nazi Party during the Second World War, right? So especially, again, if you're doing documentaries, you can get a lot of just really striking visuals right away. Just some really interesting stuff. Apparently, there was an interest in limiting people's driving, maybe to conserve fuel. I'm not sure if that's what this image is about, but a lot of really striking visual materials here. Now, you might wonder, what is this, the DPLA? What does this include? Well, it includes a number of, it basically aggregates a number of different online collections. And so there is a list here somewhere of the, okay, here it is, browse by partner. And this will give you a sense of all of the different libraries and online archives that you search when you search the Digital Public Library of America, right? So that's what makes it so valuable. It's not just one site, it's searching a lot of different others, like HathiTrust is one that's listed here. Internet Archive is also listed here somewhere. And I did just want to very quickly show you two more. Internet Archive itself is worth visiting. Again, it is included in the Digital Public Library of America. But earlier this week, I was actually, for example, assisting students, History Day students, with a project on Catherine Dunham. So we just did a quick search for the name Catherine Dunham. here in the Internet Archive. And right away, we found some really interesting sources, including an interview with Catherine Dunham, and then some recordings. She was a dancer and a choreographer in the mid-20th century who traveled globally and was influential in her field. When I searched for Catherine Dunham in the Digital Public Library of America, I got even more relevant search results, including some music recordings that she herself recorded during her travels. Very last thing I want to show you is called the Media Burn documentary archives, and that's also listed here. And for those of you, again, doing documentaries, especially maybe socially or politically related topics, this can be really interesting. I, for example, searched here for Chicago Teachers Union. Now, I can't attest to the exact date of some of this coverage, but if you search here, for example, for Chicago Teachers Union, you'll find some interesting footage from the Chicago Teachers Union, including videos of them on strike. I'm not gonna, okay, yeah, here it is. So, these you might be able to mine these for video footage for your documentaries. Now, I'm not gonna actually visit this, but I just wanna mention some other sources you might wanna check out for audio-visual materials that you could pull into your documentary projects. Can TV, History Makers, Studs Terkel Audio. Studs Terkel was a great interviewer who produced a lot of fantastic audio, interviewed a lot of relevant figures in the mid-late 20th century, and then the Ken Burns films here as well. So I'm not going to show you those, but I just want to point out that those would be useful points, places where you could find primary sources. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I know that was kind of a whirlwind tour of different resources. There isn't always a one-size-fits-all, but I hope that all of you, as you are watching this, maybe got some ideas on how to get started, at least in some of these resources, finding something that could be relevant to you. And I do just want to underscore what Chrissy emphasized, which is that you should feel free to follow up with us by making an individual appointment, to work with us. And I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in the chat once again, of that page where you can book some appointments with us for research assistance using our Calendly account. So you can get right on our calendars to get some research help if you could use it. So I think we'll stop there and maybe take any questions that folks have.
You are all so fabulous. Thank you for all of these great leads. So many great resources that you both have touched on today. I think when students are able to tackle some of these, they're going to find so many great things. And if they get stuck, they know that they can come to you to get a lot more personalized advice, which is really terrific. Thank you so much for your time and dedication to History Day researchers. We know that students in grades 6 to 12 aren't your primary audience. You do have college students that you're working with as well, but we just appreciate how generous you are with all of our students. We did have a couple of questions that came up in the chat, and there was one thing that I wanted to follow up on that you talked about, Ed, which was some of our students may be researching things that did not take place in Chicago, but yet they may still be interested in finding special collections or archival materials that are on their topic. And I just want to let our new students know, if you haven't been through History Day before, you are part of a national organization called National History Day, and the libraries and archives and special collections all across the country are familiar with History Day, the program, and with the needs of History Day researchers. So if there's something specific that you're looking for, like let's say, you're doing a lot of research on your topic, you find that it's really important that there's maybe a letter that someone wrote, or there's a particular treaty or government document or something like that, and you're like, wow, it would be really important for me to include that in my project, but I'm not finding a copy of it in a secondary source book or in some other way. It's okay for you to reach out to archives or special collections to ask for something specific. Do not tell them something like, send me everything you've got on the Second World War or the French Revolution. That is not going to be a productive request. But if there's something specific that you're looking for, very often they may be able to help you in getting access to that in some way. Explain to them who you are, why you're doing this research, and what specifically you're looking for. Oftentimes when you are doing your secondary source research, if you have a book on the topic and there's a lot of that little tiny print in the back of the book, those, we call that the gold mine. That's where the treasures are found. If you go to those footnotes, those endnotes of the back of the book, and you find, wow, there are all these other great sources, and some of these would make a great thing to include in my exhibit, and there's something specific that you're trying to find, then oftentimes archives or special collections may be able to work with you. Internationally, that can be a little bit more difficult because international archives and special collections have very different levels of support for researchers, but it's always worth an ask. You just have to allow yourself extra time if there's something specific that you're trying to get, maybe on an international topic. Just because it isn't here in Chicago doesn't mean that you can't get it at all. It just means it's a little extra legwork to try to make that happen. Two questions that came up so far that you might have some good advice, and I know, Lauren, you dropped some good tips into the chat as well. But a couple of our teachers asked about, well, what happens when you find a great photograph that is in a book, a secondary source book, and you're trying to find the original? Like, do you have any tips on how to do that? Or if you're doing a Google image search and you're trying to figure out what the original citation is, like, what are some tips for kind of working backwards? You found something cool, but maybe you don't have all the information you need. What do you do in a case like that? And the second question, I'll just phrase both questions right now so you can think about those responses, is do you have any advice on maybe some good citation generators? Like if you're stuck and you're like, okay, my teacher said that I should use MLA, or my teacher said that I should use Chicago Manual of Style to write my annotations and citations in my bibliography. Are there tools that you particularly like or suggest to students to help with formatting of the citations in a bibliography? So, all right.
Yeah, I could take the citation question. I would say that there's a two-part answer. You're probably looking for something easy and quick, which is understandable. I often am as well. But then you also want a way to check your work, right, and make sure you're doing the right thing. So I would say that for something easy and quick, I recommend this, zbib.org. It's from an organization called Zotero, which offers a more comprehensive citation I guess it would be called like some kind of citation software that supports researchers in writing research papers, keeping track of their citations. But CBIB is like the easy website that lets you start, creating citations in seconds. But, for that reason, it's not always accurate. And so the other site that I would strongly recommend is the Purdue Online Writing Lab. And let me just paste a link here to the main page. They offer some of the best citation information. So I'm just pasting that now in the chat. But you'll see here that if you visit Purdue Online Writing Lab, and actually students, I would say, really for all of you, this if you're not already familiar with it, this could really help you not only in junior high and high school, but also in college. I still use this as a occasional researcher at the university level. It offers guides to citation in MLA format, APA, and Chicago style, and those will be the links on the left-hand side under suggested resources. So that would be my answer for citations. And then, maybe others have ideas here, but I would say that if you find an image in a book, it's all right, as long as if it's a scholarly book, if that scholarly book is representing an image and citing it accordingly, it would be appropriate for you to simply copy the image as it appears in the book, and then just indicate that you are copying it from the book, and then also indicate the original source that book is taking the image from. Sometimes you can Google the image. In fact, probably a lot of times you can Google the image and find it online. But there may be cases where, let's say that, that image is taken from an archive in Tibet, and you don't, you don't feel like taking a trip across the world. You can say, well, look, I trust this scholar to have faithfully reproduced this image. It's in the book. The scholar is saying where they got it from. So I'm going to tell you where I'm getting it from, this book, as well as where the scholar is getting it from. And there should be instructions in these citation resources to help you do that, right? To cite the secondary source where that primary source is being reproduced, as well as the primary source itself. So I don't know if others have thoughts on that, but that would be my first cut into it.
Yeah, and just to kind of to add a little bit more information on kind of the Google image question, we know that it's a no man's land, and you're going to find on Google Images photos that are on blogs and websites and newspaper articles and just a variety of different places. So you're going to, you're not always going to have access to the same information about that image, right? And so kind of the first recommendation on Google image searches is temper your expectations. You unfortunately might find the perfect image, but you just can't figure out where they got it from, and you just don't feel confident kind of including that in your project because of that. So kind of temper your expectations on Google Images. My best suggestion on Google Images is do your best to look at the file, to look at the metadata that's on any information you can get, and we all know books, obviously, they'll publish kind of photos of different primary sources, and oftentimes they have underneath kind of the information about where the archive they found it in, right? It's not uncommon when you look at a blog that has a photo of a primary source for them to kind of do the same thing. So look at the posts, see if there's any additional information provided by the person who posted it, see if there's any names of who created it, or kind of what it's about, or maybe who's in the photos, details like that. Take those away and then kind of do more Google searches to see if you can find the legit site where it kind of came from. But unfortunately, I think there are just a ton of really awesome looking, great, tempting images on Google that you'll go through all of this and you won't be able to figure out where it came from and whether or not you can use it. And in those situations, unfortunately, do not use them. We like to make sure that everything is kind of sourced back to kind of reputable organizations and institutions. So that is the bit about Google Images.
Thank you also, Ed and Chrissy, for just sort of reminding our students about the importance of making sure that whatever sources they end up using for their project are coming from reputable and credible places. Like, do definitely ask yourself, like, should I believe this person? What are their credentials? Like, is this, can I trust this? And most of the sources that you will find, I think your teachers and our researchers here have led you in places where many of the things that you'll find you will be able to trust. But if you're just sort of doing a general Google search and anything might pop up, you got to look at those with a little bit more of a skeptical eye to make sure that those are in fact reputable places to be getting your information from. If it comes from, an archive or a library where okay, I can trust this, that's great. But if it's coming from a blog where you don't necessarily know who this person is or what their background is, that's something definitely look at with a more careful eye, because you want to make sure that anything you're using for your History Day research is something that is going to support you and your credibility as a researcher, and you want that to be something that is going to have quality evidence that you can use for your project as well. This is really terrific. Any more questions? You can post in the chat if you have more questions for our presenters. All right. With that, please keep your computers up, but we are going to take a 5-minute break and then we will reconvene to talk about historical thinking skills and the next steps towards turning this into your History Day project. All right, so reconvene at 10:40 a.m., please. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you're all here. We have recently just wrapped up our research workshop. We do have a couple of questions that are coming into the chat here, and I will do my very best to forward them on so you can get a response right away. If it's an individual question, I'll try to get you to the right person. If it's a question that affects the whole group, then we'll try to work it into the conversation here that we're having here today. With that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Lauren, to kick us off with some historical thinking skills conversations.
Fantastic. Let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen. I've only been Zooming for years now. All right, can you all hear me okay? Good, and you can all see my screen, everything is good? All right, cool. So what I really want to do today is talk about what to do once you have the sources that you found, whether you already have these sources or whether you use any of the tips that Ed and Chrissy have talked about today. Once you've gathered your primary and secondary sources, what do we actually do with them? And how can we think about that material more critically, more productively, and how do we incorporate it into a really meaningful History Day project? My email address is here below. Like I said earlier, I am the History Learning Specialist with Chicago Metro History Day. I'm not a walking encyclopedia on history by any means, but I am really familiar with the process of doing history. Feel free to send me, email me any questions that you have. I'm happy to meet with you, talk in more detail about your specific projects. But yeah, feel free to use me as a resource throughout the History Day contest seasons. And I know that we're all sort of at different stages in the History Day process. And I know we have a large group of students here today from a lot of different grades. So if some of this material is review for you, that's okay. My aim is to really equip you all with a handful of questions that you could apply to any of the sources that you have. So I have example sources thrown here and there throughout this presentation, really just to sort of use as examples, but feel free to use them as placeholders and put your own sources in place of the ones I've provided. And during our talk today, just really think about how your own sources would connect with these types of questions. So with that, we'll see if I've got this going all right. I do. Here's our brief outline, our agenda for today. We'll talk about a few different sort of basic historical thinking skills and really sort of what questions, basic questions to ask of your sources once you have them. I do want to go on a brief history rant about bias and how it's going to shape your projects for good or for evil, whether you want it to or not. Bias will end up shaping your research and your project. So we'll talk about how to sort of harness that bias productively and really be aware of it and how that appears in your sources as well. And then we'll talk about your thesis statements, your arguments, what actually is a good historical argument. There's no easy answer, but I will say I've taught everything from 6th grade up through college level students. And the one common thing I see most often is that people's thesis statements are not as argumentative as they want them to be. And I really want you to come into your History Day contests with really strong arguments that you can feel really confident about. And we'll end on this really good question. Might sound a little bit blunt, but I think it's really important of so what? Why does any of this matter? Why are you doing this? Why should we care? So with that, we'll get into your sources. Like Crystal mentioned a little bit earlier, I think it is really essential to make sure that you're thinking about the credibility of your sources. Where is this information coming from? Whose perspective is it representing? What does the author, the producer of the source believe? Who is their audience? Like, I think sometimes in history, we forget that all of our historical actors are individuals, just like we are, with their own agendas, their own audiences, their own plans, their own perspectives. And so if someone's going to go through the work of actually producing a primary source, you want to know why. What is really spurring this person into action? What do they want? So we have a screenshot here of a newspaper, a headline saying Teddy Roosevelt may become the next police chief of Chicago, saying that the mayor of Chicago might give him this position. Just interesting, fun tidbit that Big Bill, the mayor, was kind of really closely connected with Al Capone. Might be interesting background information to know. But the questions you might want to ask about this source or any other source you come across is who wrote this, who produced it if it's not a written document. And this would apply to secondary sources too. Why is someone creating a source like this? When was this produced? 1916 might be helpful for contextualizing the source. And is it reliable? We might know now that Teddy Roosevelt never actually became the police chief of Chicago, but that doesn't mean that this source would immediately be invalid and not useful to us. We could always ask, why is it that people are speculating about Teddy Roosevelt becoming police chief of Chicago? What is going on in Chicago so that a newspaper headline like this would really capture people's imaginations, make them ask a lot of questions, and get them to spend some money on this newspaper? So really asking these different types of basic questions about your sources. Okay. And then we really want to know more about the context. And I have a photo here, and I believe this is from the 1970s. A bunch of marchers got together, and I don't know exactly how many. This was the one picture I found. There could be many more people in front and in back of where this photo was taken. But people marching in Pilsen to demand just change. There were two major fires in just the span of a week. And people really wanted this to actually be thoroughly investigated. They want a better fire prevention program, and they want more Latino firefighters. So when we see this photo, we're going to have a lot of questions about it. When and where was the source created? We get that from the citation of the image, but we might want to know, what else is going on at this point in time? How do people living in Pilsen feel about how sort of their neighborhood fits into the city, or how do city leaders respond to their needs, if at all? Think about how life for people back then, and this wasn't that long ago, in the 70s, how might that be the same as it is today? How might people react similarly to challenges, or how might they react differently? And how might the circumstances in which this source was created actually affect the content of the source? I do think that this is a good point in time to mention that sources, even primary sources like this one, we think that maybe a photograph really captures something honestly. It's hard to sort of go back and Photoshop a historical image, at least when you're finding it from a museum, you think it's pretty accurate. But photographers are individuals too. Photographers have their own agenda. Photographers have their own bias. Someone chose to take this particular picture instead of a different one. So think about what does the fact that a picture was taken at all tell you about what's going on? All right, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. A lot of this stuff is basic information that you can find resources for on our website. So I'll move through this stuff a little bit more quickly so we can spend more time talking about bias and arguments. Okay. I also really want to sort of borrow from English teachers here and talk about close reading and what sort of doing almost like a rhetorical analysis of your written sources or even your visual sources can do for you as a historian. In any sort of source, someone is probably making some sort of a claim. It might not be saying like, oh, the mayor argued this. It might not be that obvious, but someone is going to make a claim about something if they're trying to get people's attention. So we have this excerpt over on the left-hand side advocating for a school boycott in, I believe, 1963. Also known as Freedom Day, asking people to fight school segregation. Chicago public schools at this point in time were supposed to have been desegregated by this point, but in a lot of cases that wasn't actually happening. And so we see this source saying, let Chicago know you want equal education for your children. hit back at Czar Ben Willis and his doormat school board. Ben Willis was, I believe, the superintendent of Chicago public schools at this point in time. So you might wonder, why is this source calling him a czar? He's not a Russian czar, but why might they be picking up like that particular word choice to get their point across? Back in the 60s, what is some reference to a Russian title going to make people think about? Why are they picking that particular word? They could call him a whole host of different names if they wanted to. Why that particular one? So really ask yourself, what claims is the author of this source making, and why are they saying this stuff in this particular way? What sort of evidence are they using? And this is where the zoom function on your computers comes in really handy. A lot of historical material you're gonna have to zoom in on a lot. So like this stuff down here, I am too old and don't have glasses on right now to read all of this right now, but that's a really good point to like zoom in and pick apart the word choice. What exactly are people reading when they read this source beyond just the attention-getting headlines? Is it the specific word choice? Are they using any specific phrases or drawing on any symbols? Even just the title Freedom Day, that's going to come across differently to a lot of people as a school boycott. There's a reason that this event became known as Freedom Day rather than a school boycott. One of them sounds a lot better than the other. And to think about who exactly they're trying to persuade, what is their ultimate goal, and what do people really want? If you're going to go through the trouble of making a flyer like this, or putting something in the newspaper like this, or making a poster or anything like that, if you're going to go through the trouble of boycotting school, why? All right. Bias, my favorite, I think. Are we missing something? Nope, we're not. Okay. So we sometimes think about bias as a bad thing. And usually it is. I think when we most commonly come up against bias in our lives, it's often a negative. Sometimes it can be in favor of someone or something, but it isn't always the same thing as prejudice. But I do think it is important to keep in mind as we are reading through our historical sources, as we're reading our secondary sources, and as we're creating our presentations ourselves. Bias is, whether we like it or not, a huge part of who we are. It's not always a bad thing. It can be, but it is really important to be aware of our own bias and our own bias that we're bringing to the historical research. For example, this is just me. I'm biased in favor of history. It's why I have this job. It's why I ignore math every time I'm confronted with it. It's why I just sort of turn away when I see numbers. I'm really interested in that sort of thing. I'm biased against spiders. I know that they're good for the environment. They're good for our ecosystem. But for me, they're too creepy and they're too crawly. And when I see one on my ceiling, the logical part of my brain that knows that they're good for us doesn't care. I'm also biased against rush hour traffic. So I take the train, you avoid road rage. But how does this actually become relevant? I'm also really just interested in social and cultural history. So when I'm diving into a history project and I see a chart with statistics or data on, I don't know, whether it's unemployment statistics or housing statistics or voting statistics, I just sort of have the initial tendency to skip over that stuff. My brain just immediately says, this isn't what I'm interested in right now, and goes to look for other things, even though it's very possible that even in a social or cultural history project, those sources could be really helpful for me to take a closer look at. So being aware of my own bias in history means that I just have to slow down. And when I see those charts and graphs in economic or political history, to think, maybe this could be helpful for me, take a minute and sort of catch myself before I skip over something that could be really useful. So yeah, no one is without bias, but how does that actually matter for you and doing history? I think one thing that we tend to forget about is that if you have access to sources today, especially primary sources, but if you have access to secondary sources, it's because someone somewhere along the line decided that that source was worth saving. An archivist said, we should put this in a box, or someone decided that this source should be digitized so students can access it because it's important. And those are all individuals or a group of individuals working for the same institution, making that decision to save something. It's unfortunate, but there's a lot of cool primary source material in history that just doesn't exist anymore because the box has been thrown out. Or in the case of the British National Archives, there was a mysterious fire in that part of the archive, and suddenly these really interesting records that might be kind of damaging to the British government don't exist anymore. And so really the fact that we have these sources at all is a result of bias. And also how the sources are produced. How is this source, whether it's a photograph or a recording, how is that going to shape the specific needs of the people making it or the people preserving it for any reason? And then thinking about your own bias, what sort of questions are you asking at all? You have all picked a topic, but what specific questions do you really want to know about that topic? That is all going to be sort of down to your own bias and interests. It might shape the types of sources that you consult. It will shape the type of History Day project that you choose if you want to make a documentary or a research paper, and the things that you're able to do in those different types of projects. And your own beliefs and leanings will shape the arguments you make, and even just how you're presenting this to an audience. You know, at the history contests in March, that your project is going to be in front of a panel of judges. That's going to shape how you work on this project because you know that's sort of where it's going at the end. Does anyone have any sort of initial questions about any of this stuff so far that I can answer before we get to the end of this session? Any pressing questions? Just holler at me if anything appears in the chat.
Nothing has popped up yet, except for a question about will this PowerPoint be available later? And I said, yes, we'll be happy to send that out to the teachers once we get the recording and the PowerPoint into Google Drive, probably on Monday.
Okay, fantastic. All right, time for History Rant, part 2. I believe it's time for arguments. No, it's not. More bias. Ha. All right. This is an excerpt of one of Harold Washington's speeches. And I do believe, let's see, my Zoom bar is cutting off the citation, but this is from 1984. And this was a speech after about 1 year in office that the mayor gave to an audience of the Chicago League of Women Voters. And this is the very end of the speech. So I know it's a little bit dishonest to not give you the first 41 pages of this speech, but I spent a lot of time picking out the pages I thought would be most interesting, and it happened to be the end. So I want to read very briefly the end of this speech. And as I do that, I want you to just think to yourself, how might this speech be biased? How is the bias just the fact that it's coming from the mayor? He's in politics. You probably want to be reelected, but how does the audience shape the source? How do the current things going on in Chicago shape the source? Even his word choice, how is that all shaping the way that this speech might have been interpreted or received by his audience? So I'll just read this very briefly in case it's too small. But he ends his speech by saying, "A slogan I learned in World War II was, the difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer." That's what it's been like this past year in City Hall. The difficult is in hand. Now the impossible has begun. We plan to reverse 2 decades of stagnation and decay. It's not easy, but it will be done. This is a magnificent city. Our potential is unlimited in social and economic terms, as long as we remember that Chicago works together. The success of our city is more important than anything else. I hope that you'll invite me back next year for the second annual report of what we've done. With your continued help and support, Chicago will work together in all of our lives, in the economy and in the history books. Thank you very much. So this sounds like a very, very optimistic kind of source. It sounds like the sort of rally that you might expect from someone in politics saying, we can do this. And I'm sure no matter what time period you pick in Chicago history, there's going to be a lot of problems that people want addressing. And the mayor here sounds really optimistic. He's probably tailoring this speech very much based on that. Okay. Now I want to get into our thesis statements. And that's really just an argument. We have this fancy term thesis statement, but really we want to know, what do these sources tell us? Like, why does this actually matter? Why should we care? Your thesis statement is not the topic of your project. Your thesis statement is not your topic sentence, but it's the point of your project. What is your argument? What are you really trying to convey to your audience? And how is your topic significant? If you have a bunch of questions that you're asking about your topic, your thesis statement is not going to answer the who, what, where, or when questions. If your thesis statement is going in the right direction, it will typically answer a why or a how question. And it should give your audience a sense of why this topic actually matters. 9 out of 10 times, if I see a student who has a weak thesis statement, it's typically weak because it's too broad. There aren't enough details. It's more of an observation than an argument. If you're gonna get really into an argument, it has to be specific enough to express your own interpretation of what happened and why it happened and why that matters. So here we go. I know it sounds obvious, but doing this in practice is a little trickier. Your thesis statement is not an observation. It has to be an argument. In order for it to be an argument, it has to be arguable. And that means that, say you and another student get the same set of sources and are asked the same question, you could very well come up with 2 totally different thesis statements and argue about which one of you is more right based on the evidence and your interpretation of it. An observation just means that no reasonable person would disagree with you based on the sources that they've read. So in order for it to really be a thesis statement, you need to be picking a side. You need to be taking a stand about something. When you're in your history day contest, when it's time to talk with the judges or when it's time to present your material, you really need to be making an argument. Your judges shouldn't just be sitting there just sort of like nodding your head going, yeah, no, that makes sense. I agree with that. You really need to convince them that you are right about this point and use your evidence. You're kind of playing the job of a lawyer, using evidence to really make your point. You have to be clear. You have to be specific. And you can't just be like, okay, there was, I don't know, the Great Chicago Fire was so devastating because it seemed like everything was made of wood. No one would really necessarily disagree with that point. So here we have 4 pretty bad thesis statements. Some of them are better than others, but overall, I would categorize each one of these as very weak. For example, saying Reconstruction after the Civil War was both a failure and a success. That doesn't really tell us anything. During the second half of the 19th century, immigrants came to the US from many different places and for many different reasons. Again, I'm left asking the question, so what? What am I learning from this? Taking the French Revolution, for example, saying there was no single cause of the French Revolution. That sounds a little bit more like an argument, but it still isn't really helping me as a historian understand why or how something happened. And then the last example, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, about the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking factories, made a huge impact on the foods we eat. Again, leaning closer to argument, but certainly not there. So here are just a couple of different critiques I would have of each of these statements. We want to know if Reconstruction was a failure and a success. For whom? Which specific groups was it a failure for? Which specific groups of people was it a success for? Or how specifically was it successful? How specifically was it a failure? And which side sort of had more weight to it? For what reasons was it a failure instead of a success, even if parts of it were good? With the second example about immigrants coming to the country, it's still a very general observation. Like, what point are you trying to make? Why does it actually matter that so many different people were coming to the US for so many different reasons? And like, what actually happened as a result of that? Take your thinking a step or 2 or 3 steps farther and say, so what? Because of this, what happened? With number 3 about the French Revolution, it's interesting. It's cool that there was no single cause of the French Revolution, but it doesn't tell us about how the event happened, like how we moved closer to the French Revolution, and it doesn't tell us about why the revolution actually happened when it happened. If there was no one cause, then why pick this particular time to happen? And then with number 4 about the jungle, saying what kind of impact, saying a huge impact on the foods we eat. That could be a positive impact. It could be a negative impact. It doesn't really tell us about how things changed or why that matters. So just keep asking these questions of yourself every step of the way. Why does this matter? Why, like, what actually happened as a result of this? And who specifically or what specifically am I talking about? Be as absolutely specific as you can be. All right. And again, to sort of emphasize this question, and I don't mean to put it that bluntly, but why should we care? You have gone through all of this work to do a History Day project. You've spent months working on this, especially by contest time. You were going to go through all of the work of creating this project and presenting this project. And imagine that you've done that and you've presented it. And then maybe one of your judges asks you, well, so what? Why should I care? Oh, and we want to make sure we have an answer to that question before they ask it. Why should anyone care about the research you've done? Yes, it's a History Day project. I'd hope you're doing all of these projects willingly, but maybe it's a part of a class and you just kind of have to, or you feel like you should do this project, but why should we actually care? What sort of implications does your research have for our lives today? Or what sort of implications does your research have for the way that we think about a particular period in history or the history that has come after it in the decades or even centuries after your event? Why do this research at all? Why does it matter? Because it does matter. But we need to think about how to articulate it. If you're actually going through all of the work to investigate this project, there is a why there somewhere, more than just, oh, it's for History Day. It's because you found it interesting, and you found it interesting why. And so be sure to think about this question. Why does it actually matter, your findings? And that why can really lead you to articulate your argument in a more argumentative way, to develop a stronger thesis statement about the implications or of your events or the thing that you're studying, and to really make your project more meaningful to your audience. If your judges are going to sit through the whole presentation, why can we take up that much of their time? What can we give them to take home to think about afterwards? Why should they walk away from your project saying, okay, 1, I learned something, 2, that was well done, but also 3, that gives me a lot of questions to think about even after I leave the History Museum, or after I leave UIC on contest day, or after I've met with the other judges virtually. Why should I continue caring about this project? Why does it still matter? If you ever feel sort of stuck in your research, or you feel stuck once you've found your sources and don't know what to do with them, ask yourself this question: why should we care? Because we should, but it's up to you to sort of really articulate how and why it matters. So with that, that is all of the things that I'm going to throw at you today. I'll happily take more questions now. We have a Q&A session following this. Again, drop your name and school in the chat if you want to be entered into our prize drawing. Again, feel free to sign up for those research consultations with Ed or Chrissy. Also email me if you want a one-on-one coaching session with History Day staff here. We're more than happy to help you. But yeah, here's my email. Use it, send me any questions you have, and we will send out this PowerPoint later if you'd like to look at it again.
Fabulous, Lauren. Thank you so much for that. We do have a great question that popped up in the chat, and I'm going to briefly talk about it when I kind of do some wrap-up comments about kind of moving forward, History Day evaluation and things. But I wanted to give you the question so you can think about it as well, and you can contribute to it, because it connects back to what you were saying about bias. And it's a really meaningful question that I know that all of our students have to deal with in some way or another. How do we illustrate biases in our projects without making the argument seem too one-sided? I want to briefly talk about the History Day evaluation before we fully answer that question, because I want to be able to students to see the connection between what we're looking for in the project and what you've just discussed, Lauren, and this question of illustrating biases. So hang on just a second. I'm going to share my screen. So Anka's question was a terrific one, and was a great lead into the History Day evaluation. And I wanted to briefly share this with you. This is what the evaluation form is going to look like, or a slightly more beautiful version of this will be what your evaluation form looks like when you come to the competition. It will be nicely digitized when you see it, but it's easy to read here. So the specific piece that I wanted to draw out with this question about bias and how to show it in a project is kind of comes up in multiple parts of our evaluation criteria. The first is, and probably the most direct way that it shows up in our History Day evaluation, is that we are looking for History Day students to have a variety of different perspectives in their project. So your project may tend to emphasize one person or one group or one figure in history, but that person's perspective is not the only one. And in order to understand their perspective well, you have to consider different kinds of perspectives in contrast to what that person was thinking. So to use the example that Lauren gave earlier about Freedom Day, it's not just important to look at the students who were protesting. Yes, that's one really important perspective. That may be the primary focus, the primary lens that you use in your project, but it's not the only one. We have to look at that in contrast to whatever the school administrators were saying. We have to look at that in contrast to what the teachers were saying about that event. We have to look at it in contrast to parents. And none of these groups are monolithic. Different groups, even within the same group, there may be many different lenses. Your project and your perspective will be made much stronger if you show that you have looked at different kinds of viewpoints on that topic. And that's what we're getting at when we're getting at this piece in our perspective, or piece in our evaluation called multiple perspectives. Lauren also addressed this, this question that I think guides the whole discipline of history, like professional historians and people who deal with archives and special collections and all sorts of things, were that so what question, it sounds a little funny when you first hear it as a student, but it is really sort of the driving question that we're trying to figure out when we deal with history at all. Is we're trying to figure out, what is the impact of this? What is the change over time that happens? Why does this still matter to us today? What are the big questions that this helps us to understand better in history? So getting at that so what question is a really important one, whether you're doing History Day or whether you're just studying history down the road. It's the same question that guides us who work in history through the years as well. Again, on historical argument and thesis and claim, we're really looking for your ideas, for your claims, your evidence. We want to see what it is, like Lauren was saying, that is your point of view that you're trying to persuade us of. That's a very fundamental element of the History Day project, and probably the most difficult piece for many students. So these are the elements that we'll be looking for when we look at your projects later on. I also really quickly wanted to mention our required written materials. Since we're talking specifically about research today, I know that your teachers have already given you a lot of guidance about what your research and note-taking and bibliography requirements look like at your particular school. But because we're talking about research today, I want to remind you that one element that you're going to have to do in your projects is have the required written materials, which have 3 pieces to them. One is the title page. You can go to the rule book to figure out what needs to be on the title page. The second is a process paper where there are several questions about how you researched and developed your project and what your argument is. You are going to specifically answer those in your process paper. And again, refer to the rule book for those details. And finally, the piece of the program that really connects in with our topic today of research is the annotated bibliography. So it's so important in any kind of historical research to show where you got your information from. And that's a big part of the History Day puzzle, is sharing what sources you used and how they contributed to your thinking about your topic. The 3 big points that I wanted to make about annotated bibliography today is just to remind you that you have to follow a style guide. And a style guide is just a fancy way of saying, oh, how do I share the information about where I got this source? So that includes things like the title, the date of publication, who published it, if it's a digital source, a URL. What are those key details so that someone else could find that same source if they were looking for that same source as well? There are 2 ways that we allow in History Day to present that information. One is MLA, one is Chicago Manual of Style. Either way is okay. You just have to be consistent. Your teacher will probably tell you which one they want you to use in your school. So if you're not clear on what that is, be sure that you ask. The annotated bibliography should also be separated into primary sources and secondary sources. And then finally, your annotation, that is just a fancy way of saying that there are a couple of sentences after the citation where you explain how you use the source and how the source helped you to understand your topic. You don't necessarily need to summarize everything that was in the source. That's not the purpose of the annotation. The purpose of the annotation is so that we can see why you selected the source and how it was helpful to you in the course of your project. So make sure that you have that in your 2 sentences, usually in your annotation. A reminder again, please do sign up with our NEIU research coaches, Ed and Chrissy. We'll drop that into the chat one more time, just so you have easy access to that link so you know how to book with them. And if you would like coaching about your project, not necessarily about the research side of things, but you're trying to ask questions about maybe the thesis, your draft thesis, or your outline of your project, or something about the putting together your final project, then please do reach out to Lauren to set up a coaching session with our staff members. Her email address is here. And I think I'm gonna stop my share there. Yeah, okay. All right, so I want to make sure that I drop the link into the chat of, again, for the research coaching with Ed and Christy from, sorry. Here it is. So if you're trying to set up a conversation with Ed and Christy to get a guidance about research, please do that there. And if you're trying to reach Lauren for coaching about the project itself, her email address is here and she can connect with you on that. All right, any further questions or things that our presenters would like to share before we do our raffle prize?
Could I say just one more thing about this question that we had in the chat about how do you show the bias in your projects without making it sound too one-sided, without making your argument sound too one-sided? And I think that's a fantastic question. One that is where your annotated bibliography can come in handy. You can sort of point out maybe the problems with each source, even though it was helpful. But I also think, and I promise this is my last history rant of the day, is that history isn't as impartial as we think it is. Even when we're faced with textbooks that we think might even be like really boring and dry, those still aren't impartial. Someone is making that deliberate choice to include some information and not other information. So your argument should be taking a stand. And when you take a stand, not everyone is going to agree with you, but it's your job to show that you've thought critically about all the multiple perspectives that you've come across and that you've come to your argument through a very sort of logical, critical analysis of your sources. It isn't up to you to be an impartial robot, sort of taking in these sources and spitting out the rational answer. It's going to be partial and biased in a way. It's just up to you to show that you're not just sort of only considering one side.
Great. We did have a question that popped up in the chat, and I'm hoping that Gabrielle can give us a little bit more detail about her question, but it's a good one. It's she's having some trouble finding sources from other points of view, especially in a topic that deals with another country, and she's wondering about the sources that could help her with that. Thank you for giving us some more details. This is a good example of a topic that has lots of different perspectives, and even language could be an issue with this particular topic and the sources that are available. She says she's doing the Cuban Missile Crisis and she's having trouble finding and expressing points of view from the Soviet Union, for example.
Yeah, I could jump in there. So as you mentioned, Crystal, one issue is that there may be a language barrier, right? So you could look to see if you could find archives of English language publications. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Soviet Union probably put out at least some newspaper in the English language to reach readers around the world. But the other thing I would keep in mind, and this is really for everyone, you can always think about differing points of view on a topic, right? As like people from different countries having different points of view. But also, and this is very clear if you think about our society and our politics today, also think about how different people within the same country might have differing points of view, right? Based on politics, based on ideology, based on worldview, sometimes culture, right? So for example, if your topic is the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's very important to think about how the Communist Party in the United States was very closely aligned with the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party was busy during the years before and during and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, publishing newspapers and giving speeches and making various headlines in the United States. The government was also repressing them. But I'm sure that the Communist Party in the United States had things to say about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm sure that what they had to say pretty closely aligned with the views of the government of the Soviet Union. And on top of that, there were actually additional left-wing groups in the United States. Some considered themselves Marxist or socialist or communist, who may have departed from the perspective of the Soviet government, but may have still had somewhat critical perspectives that were pretty distinct from those of the American government, may have even also been distinct from those of the Cuban government. And so, so I would think about that. See if you can find differing perspectives on the American far left, including but possibly not limited to those of the Communist Party of America. And I think you'll find a lot of English language sources there that can help you to get a little bit closer to the point of view of the government of the Soviet Union.
The other quick note that I wanted to kind of inject into this, how do you kind of deal with your own bias? How do you deal with like the issues of bias in sources and materials? And so, you know, I think this topic is one that historians are very aware of. There is no shame in saying, you know, I tried to find, you know, Soviet language publications to get the Soviet perspective, but, you know, just the language was a barrier. You know, that is kind of an additional, you know, section that maybe future researchers, you could kind of like call out like, hey, this is an area that I thought I would love to include, but I couldn't do it for this, that, and the other. But that's an area that maybe future researchers or future research could be done. And so, you know, it's not like was sort of explained, it's not that you are expected to kind of ingest information and spit it back out and just be a factual kind of cold reading. It's more that you are displaying that you are aware of the various kind of biases that you bring to it, the various biases of the people that created your sources, but that also the way that maybe bias sort of stands in the way of you being able to access different sources. And so, you know, that can be a portion where you kind of acknowledge that this is an avenue that I wanted to take, but I just couldn't for this, that, and the other. You know, including that in your project will really, I think, just be for the judges. They will be delighted, because that would be a very exciting kind of display of historical thinking.
Just one other thought to add to that is that it's my understanding of the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis that that the Soviet government was actually somewhat divided within itself on how to respond. And this is, again, something we're familiar with in our own time, right? The heads of states are not always perfectly in line with the government bureaucracies that they inherit when they take power, right? And so there can sometimes be conflicts there within you know, within a single government. There may be people with differing points of view. So you might want to see if you can find any documents, you know, for example, maybe letters or communications from the Soviet president to, I believe, President Kennedy from that time, and then, you know, see if you can figure out if the sources seem to indicate that there were any differences of view between, you know, within the Soviet government, between maybe the president and, for example, some of the military staff or the generals. You know, again, there may be a language barrier there, but at least some of that has probably been declassified. Some of it may have been translated, right? And so this would be a perfect, you know, context to set up a research consultation. We can dig into this a little bit more. But yeah, I think you'll find some sources if you look for those different historical actors.
Really terrific question. For any students who have a Cold War related history project, just wanted to let you know about the Cold War International History Project. I dropped the link into the chat if that's a possibility for you. They've digitized a lot of materials, not just from the American perspective, but from a worldwide perspective. It's just good to know that it's out there, can help you connect to that. Next question, could you speak to the issue of audience? Is my project for an audience that is other middle schoolers versus someone other than? That's a great question. That's yeah, great distinction there. So when your first stage of this project is at the school level, and so I think at many schools, you will have an opportunity to share it with your classmates. However, at the competition, if you go on to the regional competition, or even if you have a competition within your schools, this sometimes happens, or some kind of event within your school, it might not be necessarily a competition. Often you're sharing this with it to be evaluated by adults. So our judges at the competitions at the regional level are volunteers. They're usually very interested in history. We have a lot of people who are involved in the history world in some way or another. We have a lot of educators, and we have just community members who are interested and invested and excited about students exploring and sharing their ideas with you, who will be looking at these projects. They are using that rubric that I shared earlier, the one that talks where we'll be evaluating, and I can drop the link to that in the chat, where we'll be evaluating you on the strength of your argument. So that's the thesis and the claim, the strength of your research, how well have you addressed context, how well have you addressed multiple perspectives, and so on. And so whether it's students or whether it is an adult audience, they're going to be looking for the same things. And I'm actually really quickly going to pull up that the evaluation language. They are slightly different based on which category you're in. But you can look at that once you've selected your category, and it will give you the criteria that we are looking for. All right, with that, this is going to be our last question of the day. We're going to do some quick raffle prizes. For that, I'm going to turn it over to Lily. And then if you have any further questions, Lily's going to be our final thing for today. So we'll be saying our goodbyes at that point, but we will stick around for a little while later if anyone has individual questions they would like to ask. All right, Lily, let's take it.